Hi, I'm Josh Carter, and this is Flying for Life. In the wake of southern Brazil's worst ever climate disaster, where floods in the state of Rio Grande do Sul made 600,000 people homeless, I speak to pilot and operations director Jacob Anderson from MAF's affiliate in Brazil, Asas de Socorro, which means Wings of Help. I'm also joined by climate change expert Caroline Pomeroy, who heads up Climate Stewards in the UK, which help organisations measure and reduce their carbon footprint. When flying is a lifeline rather than a luxury, with the help of my two guests, I navigate the tricky relationship between aviation and environmental impact. Jacob and Caroline, welcome. Great to have you here. Jacob, we'll start with you first of all. Now, you work for ADS. What does your operation look like? Tell us, how many planes have you got and what are you up to day to day?
So the organization in Portuguese here in Brazil is called Asas de Socorro. So that's where those three initials come from, ADS. And in the day-to-day, we call it Asas to just make it easy. We have 4 aircraft that operate on a day-to-day basis, serving missionaries and Bible translators and local indigenous churches and whoever needs to get from point A to point B. When many of these places, the airplane is often the only way to get from point A to point B because of the difficulties of the terrain and shallow rivers and waterfalls in between the two places. So that is why we exist. The Amazon jungle is massive, and the airplane just speeds the work by an incredible amount.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for us in the UK to actually understand how vast Brazil is, because I know that you work in the southern parts of Brazil where the floods have been recently, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that actual area alone is about the same size as the UK. I think one state, isn't it?
Correct. Yep. Which I hadn't quite gathered, grasped that myself. But when I heard that, I was like, yeah, it's a big place. I think the fun thing we like to quote is there's an island in the mouth of the Amazon that's bigger than Switzerland. So just put that, try to process that.
Brilliant. I don't think the Swiss will like that very much, but
Right.
yeah. Caroline, let's bring you in. Welcome along. You're from Climate Stewards. Who are they and what do they do?
Hi, good to be with you. So Climate Stewards is a Christian organisation, and we help people to understand what is climate change, why does it matter, why as Christians should we take it seriously, and what can we do about it. Specifically, we work with churches and individuals and organisations in the Christian world particularly to help them to measure their carbon footprint, and we've done that with MAF, to think about ways to reduce it, and then to offset those carbon emissions. That's by supporting projects which mitigate the carbon, which take that CO2 out of the atmosphere, so kind of compensate for our carbon footprint.
Yeah, great. Well, I look forward to unpacking some of that in a bit. Jacob, let's come back to you, because recently, really what kind of sparked this episode, if you like, of the podcast is the flooding that you've seen there in that southern region of Brazil, the worst flooding really that you've seen in a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think, it kind of took me in particular by surprise. In the US, we're used to the hurricanes hitting Florida and the earthquakes hitting California. And, my wife grew up in a town in Minnesota that was destroyed by a tornado 100 years ago. Brazil doesn't have any of that. But, things do flood. Of course, we've got the Amazon jungle and hundreds of inches of rain fall every year throughout the country. And so when we first started hearing, well, there's flooding in the south, which is really a long way from here. We're in a big country, and even, it's a 5 or 6 hour flight in our fastest aircraft. And okay, yeah, so there's flooding. And then they put out a graphic that said that it had displaced more people and in a bigger area than Hurricane Katrina did back in the US, 20 years ago. And that's when it really kind of piqued our attention, and we got in contact with other organizations that were already on the ground here, in the South, and were shocked by how much devastation really there was, by how widespread it was and how many people were out of their homes. And yeah, started to looking for ways to help. The first airport we landed at down in this state was actually essentially an island. As we flew in, the fields around it were flooded. The town on the other side, there was only like one access in. And, by God's grace, the flood just hadn't covered that runway. And it was being used as a central distribution point. We dropped off like 200 kilos of medical supplies, and it went directly to a hangar that from there they were distributing to the neighboring communities. One airport that we wanted to use was underwater, and we had to alternate to a different one. But where we ended up actually helping, fortunately, had runway service still.
So I know that one of the planes you mentioned that you've got is a float plane, isn't it? So were you able to use that, or is that not really appropriate for that situation?
That was my first thought. If we're talking about a flood, we should probably take the float plane. But as we started investigating and, understanding exactly what was affected, what we needed was a faster aircraft capable of carrying more cargo. And because, a lot of the roads were open, if they were just in slightly higher terrain, we were able to provide the transportation, and then just passed it off to local pastors or whatever who by truck went to the harder hit areas.
So how close can you actually get to the people you're trying to help? You're flying into a flooded area. I'm assuming it's probably still raining hard. How close do you get? What's the practicalities of that?
One of the airports we landed at was a peninsula. The water had come up on all three sides, but fortunately the runway itself was just high enough that it was still able to be used. And I think it was no matter than, like an hour or two by truck from where we landed to where the area was most hit. The supplies just had to make that last stretch by truck.
So who exactly were you helping there? Who did you help?
One example was a young lady that we picked up that had been displaced from her home, but also in the process had broken both of her arms. And so she's out of her home, unable to really care for herself at all because both forearms were broken, and had family in a state several hundred miles away. And even just to get out of her little town, which was pretty heavily hit, was like a 3-hour drive on the muddy roads that had been affected by the flood. And so no airlines flights were getting there, and the bus wasn't going because of the closed roads. And so we were able to land at a small airport. Yeah, that ended up just being a 3-hour drive for her that, somebody gave her a ride. Obviously, she couldn't drive. And then we did a 2.5-hour flight so that she could be back with family.
Who else were you able to help?
And then the second group of people we ended up doing a flight for was an autistic man who was, my age. He was in his mid 40s, but severely autistic to the point where, not non-communicative. And he lived with his elderly mother in a house that was underwater. And they had family members that live up in central Brazil, close to where our headquarters were. And kind of the same thing, any other transport method out of there was just for an elderly mother and a 45-year-old gentleman who can't really care for himself. It was impossible. They looked at bus and tried to find a plane ticket, but they were in the extreme south part of the state. And the closest open airport was a several-hour trip. And yeah, they were looking for solutions. Then they heard that we had an airplane there coming back to 2 hours from where their family lived. And so we really saw it as a God moment that just put the two things together. We were coming back anyway. And when we landed here, the mother just cried with joy and gratefulness for the help we were able to provide them as a family.
Oh, wow. It's great to hear. How do you prioritize who to help? Because everybody must need something.
We really saw God's hand in every step. We left our headquarters here and we knew where our first stop was going to be. And even that didn't work out. We were stopping for fuel at a location en route, and that airport ended up closing because of bad weather. And we okay, we've got to go to an alternate. We went and landed at point B, and there we walked into the administration building, and we're talking about flight plans and this sort of stuff. And they realized we were headed to the south to help, and they said, "Guess what? Somebody just dropped off an entire cooler full of insulin that is headed to the diabetic hospital in the town we were headed to."
Wow.
And right. And so we said, yeah, they didn't know how it was supposed to get there. Somebody just dropped it off, I guess, praying that somebody would pass by and be able to take it. And then suddenly we show up. And so within a few hours of it being delivered, we dropped it off within a few blocks of where this hospital was. And, God prioritized every leg of the flights for us.
That is so cool to hear.
We actually ended up carrying something like 1,000 kilos of medicine and food supplies. It was just exactly what God had for us. The other example that I think is just so key to this is we picked up the lady with the broken arms and flew her, to a different state and dropped her off. And totally unbeknownst to us, we land there, and that airport had been collecting donations to send down south. And they didn't have a way to get them there. And they'd actually had some food that was rice and beans and oil and onions and the typical Brazilian food that was close to its expiration date. And they were like desperate to get it, to people who needed it. And when we showed up saying we were headed back, they're basically like, "You guys are an answer to prayer." And so we stuffed that airplane so full of blankets and clothing and food. And then another flight where we thought we were going to go pick up this couple, the young man, the man and his mother. And we headed that way, and that airport closed again because of bad weather. It got rained in. And so we had to divert again for the second time in just a few days, 100 miles to the west, okay, we're going that way. We're going to go land there. We knew of a pastor in that location. And so en route, I sent him a text and said, "Hey, we've got 350 kilos of supplies here. Can you use them?" "Absolutely. Tomorrow, we are leaving in a truck to the hardest hit area of the entire flooding. We need food. We need blankets. We need clothing." And so we landed at night, offloaded the airplane in the dark, filled their truck with supplies that by 9:00 the next morning were delivered. This food that was close to its expiration date by 9:00 the next morning was in the hands of people who needed it. So we just marveled at God's provision and direction the entire time.
It's so good to hear. What supplies and essentials were they that you were delivering at that point?
This is a place in southern Brazil where it's winter, and it was 5 degrees Celsius when we were going around, and a lot of people had lost their clothing and blankets, and so a big chunk of it was just warm clothes for these people that were hunkered down in shelters without warm clothing. And then lots of medical supplies, medicine and the insulin that I mentioned, just basic things too, gauze and tape for whatever purpose was needed. But there was a medicine shortage after just a short time. So yeah, several hundred kilos of just the basic medicines, antibiotics and stuff was part of every load we did.
So what sort of thing are you seeing now? Because I think this happened back in April, didn't it? What's happening?
Currently, yeah, all the rivers are back way below flood stage, and most of the roads are back operational. The one big airport is still underwater, or at least being repaired. And so that's severely hampered air transport when you're talking about airline service. Mm-hmm. But I also checked a site that tracks energy, power production, and everything's back online. So I think at this point, I counted like maybe 10 bridges that are out. And then, so I think what's going on now is the reconstruction of things like that. And then people just still cleaning out their houses. We got a report, it was a couple weeks ago now, but it was taking people like 7 days of like a team of 5 or 6 people to dig all the mud out of their homes. what they were saying is that it wasn't just mud, it was, oily, greasy type sludge from whatever it got mixed with as it filled their homes. So just a lot of work to get them clean.
Caroline, let's just bring you back in. Why do these types of things happen? Big floods like this?
Climate change essentially means that the energy from the sun is being trapped by an ever-increasing layer, like a blanket, around the atmosphere, which is trapping more heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And that with more energy in the system, everything happens faster, heavier, stronger, longer. That's essentially what's happening with climate change. So I prefer the term climate chaos, for example, to global warming, because people will sometimes say, well, it's not warmer here, it's wetter, or it's colder actually sometimes. It's about an imbalance in the system, and it's about unpredictable weather. And generally with the flooding, it will be because there will be other factors as well. There may be other factors about how land is being used, or how trees have been felled, or how agricultural systems are changing. There'll be lots of other reasons about how rivers are dredged or not dredged, all sorts of other factors which will affect flooding, people building in floodplains, lots of other things which will make flooding a more serious issue than perhaps it has been before.
We hear the phrase burning fossil fuels a lot. What does that actually mean? Because I can't really remember too much of it from my science lessons. So if you can try and give it to us in a digestible form, what is that actually all about?
Okay, so in the Industrial Revolution, which started in the UK largely, we discovered that you could burn fossilized fuel, essentially. So coal, oil, and gas are the three main fossil fuels. So they're basically the result of years of things decomposing and getting pressurized and being buried under the surface of the earth. And if you then extract them, and burn them as coal or oil or gas, when you do that, the chemical reaction releases that fossilized carbon back into the atmosphere. And we've never done that before at anything like this rate. Well, since the Industrial Revolution, it's getting faster. It has got faster and faster in the 20th century and 21st century, yeah, as we have increasingly burned more and more fossil fuels and released those heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. So that's carbon dioxide, methane. There are some others as well. But the main one is CO2. And sometimes people will say, yeah, but it's irrelevant because carbon dioxide is only a tiny percentage of our atmosphere, but it's a very potent percentage. It has this heat trapping impact, which means that we are trapping energy in this blanket around the Earth, which then is driving global weather systems. Melting ice caps or glaciers means that sea levels rise. A vast proportion of the world's population live very, very close to sea level, essentially. If you think of many of the world's major cities are very, very close to sea level. In the Pacific, for example, many islands are going underwater as we speak. So there are huge implications and ramifications. In the past, the climate has changed, but never this fast, and never on a planet with 7.2 billion people, many of them living, as Jacob said earlier, in very vulnerable places, on riverbanks or by the coast or that kind of thing.
You mentioned the sea levels, and
yes,
you mentioned global temperatures going up and the sea
yes,
level going up. So have you got any stats for us, like in the last 10 years, how has that increased?
Since 1850, which is when it's sort of the benchmark, when things started to get measured seriously. And you may have heard people talk about 1.5 degrees. Certainly in the UK, we talk a lot about this is a sort of a ceiling. And the United Nations Paris Agreement, which is a global treaty on climate, they set the target of global temperature shouldn't rise more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's before we started burning fossil fuels. Well, currently we're at about 1.3 degrees. So we haven't got much left. That's how far, that's how far we've got already. We're on track for global warming by the end of the century of between 2 and 3%, which is serious, very serious. It's a lot more than 1.5. Last year, 2023, was the warmest ever recorded. The last decade we've just had is the warmest decade ever recorded. So that curve is still going up fast.
Yeah.
And sea level rises. There are some parts of the world where where they're rising faster. It's not, fun enough, it's not a completely even distribution because of global currents and things like that. But the predictions are that by the end of this century, if we don't do anything about climate change, sea levels will rise by between 20 centimetres and 1 metre. Now, 20 centimetres may not sound very much, but if you think about the number of people who live very close to the coast, it's quite important. And it's not just the sea levels, it's things like if you're farming close to the sea, you get the sort of salination effect. So the groundwater is salty, and that means your crops don't grow. So there are huge implications. These are our global neighbours, and if Jesus teaches us to love our neighbour, then the people who are being impacted by climate change are those who have least resources to be able to deal with it. And whether they're people living in flooded countries whose maybe their houses are not built very strongly, they don't have some of the defences that we might have, they don't have early warning systems, they're reliant on their crops which have just been flooded. There's a whole host of reasons why people who are poorer generally are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
And Jacob, would you agree with that? Is that what you saw in the southern state of Rio Grande? Is that true?
Yeah, I think the thing that people have been talking about is how much land gets cut for agriculture. And that's such a hard thing because obviously we need food. Obviously we need our soybeans to grow. And I think this state produces 70% of Brazil's rice. And Brazilians live on rice and beans, but it obviously has to be done in a responsible way. When we fly over agricultural areas more in central Brazil, you can see how much effort is put into getting as close to the river or as close to the stream as possible with the field. There'll be the tiniest sliver of trees. And that was the floodplain. There was an area where when the flooding did happen, it could go out of the river and have a place to occupy for a while until it dries back down. Well, you build your field right to that and then put your town there. Obviously, it takes one little blip of rain more, and then you've got flooding. And I think that is for sure key. Even if there wasn't climate chaos, as Caroline said, which is a good term, just the normal ups and downs of a cyclical rainy season could be enough to cause flooding, where normally, if they'd left the marshes and left some of the riverbank as it was, it would not flood, 70% of Brazil's rice production.
Yeah.
The capital of Rio Grande State, the city of Porto Alegre, 600,000 people were displaced. I think it's like 500,000 of them lived in that city. And because that is where the river was draining into the ocean. This main river goes through the capital city, which is on the bay, leading to the ocean. And that capital city is, 1.5 million people. And it's at an elevation of 10 meters. So, it doesn't take much for the river to come up, and part of the problem is that the bay is this massive thing, and it's got one tiny little outlet to the sea. So the state drains through this river, and if it can't drain out fast enough through this little slit out into the ocean, then it floods, and that's exactly what happened. And when you're at 10 meters, you don't have much to work with.
The current estimate by 2030, which is really very soon, 200 million people around the world will have been displaced by climate-induced disasters of various kinds. So whether that's flooding or drought or fire or whatever. But you think about the level of human suffering that involves. There are lots of organizations talking about poverty, about health, about education, lots of really important things. And so often, many of the issues we're dealing with, even in the case of MAF, are caused, or at least partly caused, by climate change.
And Caroline, what do you think the answer to that is?
Collectively, I think we need to take climate change more seriously. Globally, Governments tend to think in short-term cycles. I'm sure this is true in Brazil as much as it is in many parts of the world. And they're trying to win votes, and whether that's by, increasing agricultural production so that people can put food on the table. We understand why all of those things happen. There really is no doubt now that about the science of climate change, that burning fossil fuels is contributing to warming the world. Climate change is a moral problem. It really is about us living more simply so that others may simply live. And I think we have huge potential to communicate that and to put that into practice with and through our churches, which that will then affect how people vote. It'll affect how they manage their land. It'll affect how they live in terms of their consumption or lack of it. So it's a huge range of things, which if people understand that climate change is hurting our global neighbours first and worst, then that's something that they're called as Christians to do, then I think, there's huge potential for change.
So is it mostly to do with growing population? Should we just stop having as many kids? Is that the answer? Or is it that we stop eating meat, or we don't drive our car? What do we do about this?
Yes, clearly more people means more impact, but not at an even rate, because those of us in the West have a big carbon footprint. The average carbon footprint in the UK is around roughly 10 tons of carbon emissions per person per year. In Kenya, it's probably less than a ton. In America, it's 15 to 20 tons. And it depends, obviously, on the individual. But the point is, we are using up more than our fair share of our emissions quota. So the fact that there are more of us clearly has an impact, but how we live and what we consume is the other part of that multiplication. You're multiplying the number of people by what they're consuming. Yeah. And when I mentioned earlier decarbonising the economy, the biggest things are switching to generating electricity from renewable sources. So as we're talking about solar, we're talking about wind, tide, so being more efficient, insulating, being much more efficient with energy conservation, finding different ways to get about in day-to-day life, whether that's walking and taking the bus or cycling or whatever, that kind of thing. And that's a large part of our footprint, our travel, and what we eat. And what we eat is a bigger part. And certainly, there's no doubt about it, that eating, meat is a very intensive form of energy. You're converting plant protein into meat. Is the ratio of about 10 to 1 for beef. So if we ate, what we would say is eat further down the food chain. We're not saying everyone should become vegans, but if we eat less meat and better quality meat, and preferably meat that is not fed on soya beans, which come from the deforested Amazon, that's really important. And it is one of the biggest things we can do, is to change our diet to eat less meat and dairy, more pulses, grains, vegetables, that kind of stuff. It's probably cheaper and it's probably healthier as well. So it's, many wins.
Are Jacob and other pilots making things worse, though? Because you're talking about carbon emissions. What about Jacob's fuel and all the stuff that he has to get his plane flying here, there, and everywhere? Some might say, well, is that just making matters worse? Are you causing a flood to happen at another point later down the line by going to help these people? I know you've been helping MAF with that, Caroline, haven't you? Because it is a tricky one, that, isn't it?
It's a tricky one. It really is. Yes, of course, flying, it contributes to global carbon emissions. Around 2% of global emissions come from aviation. What percentage of those come from MAF's planes is another question. It'll be very, very, very small, because enormous jumbo jets, or even just commercial planes going all over the place that many of us will take regularly for lots of different reasons, have huge footprints. Little tiny MAF planes will have much, much smaller footprints. Really what we're doing is we're comparing how would Jacob have helped get that medicine or that aid to a different part of the country, these big distances over terrible roads or no roads. What are the alternatives? And every organisation we work with is doing this constant thing of weighing up the alternatives. And what many organisations, including MAF, are really thinking seriously about this. How can we reduce this? And I know MAF is looking into sustainable aviation fuels. They're looking into electric planes. They're really thinking, how can we do things as efficiently as possible with as little impact on the planet? We looked at a project for BMS, Baptist Missionary Society in Chad, where they have put solar panels on the roof of some of their hospitals. And they used a MAF plane to fly those panels from one end of Chad to the other over some very rough territory. And we worked out that it's around 1,000 kilometers, the distance between N'Djamena, which is the capital, up to Bardai, which is in the north. And the emissions for that flight would be 1.75 tons of carbon dioxide for carrying those, so panels and other things that they needed to get. The comparative journey in a Land Cruiser, a big four-wheel drive, would have had emissions of about 0.8 of a ton, so about half. But you probably need two of those. I mean, they're much smaller than a Cessna.
What was worse? Was it the Land Rover or the plane in your Chad example with the solar panels?
So the plane was twice the emissions of the Land Rover, but to get those solar panels, I suspect they wouldn't have all fitted in one Land Rover. So in which case it's almost the same.
Yeah, I've got a statement here actually from MAF International. They say MAF International working hard to increase its solar energy usage by installing more solar panels on MAF homes and offices across the globe. We're less reliant on burning fossil fuels to provide electricity to buildings. We're also increasingly using state-of-the-art flight simulators as part of our global pilot training program to reduce the number of hours spent in the air. MAF continues to invest in this area, which will help to reduce carbon emissions whilst maintaining high quality training. Jacob, how does it make you feel, that you are working in an industry that is a pretty significant contributor to what we've been talking about?
Really, when you weigh all the carbon emissions that there are, you can evaluate and say, well, what we're doing is flying for life, just like the slogan is, and that it is worth it. I don't think in the flying we were doing, that it went through our minds that, yeah, we could be potentially contributing to the problem. But just so many of the things that even in that statement you read from MAF International about working as efficiently as possible, it just rings so well. We also operate 2 aircraft that are in the flight school that we run here to train missionary pilots to go work on the field. And just in looking at the cost and the fuel used to fly those aircraft, just 2 months ago, the decision was made to drastically reduce that footprint by swapping out those aircraft for smaller, drastically more efficient. Something like an aircraft that goes from 35 liters an hour of fuel used to like 12. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, very much the efficiency is on the forefront, and they are looking at diesel engines for the aircraft that we operate, the Cessna 206, which kind of the same thing. It would take the fuel used per hour from like 50 liters down to 32 or 33, so a 30% reduction in fuel just by swapping the type of engine. And I mean, that kind of news is just fantastic. The more that can happen is great. And we're always, there's constant news of the electric airplanes. And if that ever becomes viable technology, in a heartbeat, we'll switch.
Caroline, what do you think about what Jacob was saying there about the reduction in the fuel usage there?
Well, I mean, fantastic. There's more and more work being done on how to decarbonize all of life, whether that's fuels which are burnt in planes or trains or cars or anything else. It's fantastic. I mean, it's really, really good. And it's fantastic to hear that MAF is, actively pursuing this and is very aware of these issues. I think it's just really encouraging.
Caroline, so some people would say, all aviation is bad, but MAF would obviously disagree with that. So who's right?
Everything we do has a carbon footprint. And so I think in all of life, we are weighing up the costs and the benefits of what we're doing. MAF is an efficient organization that is trying its hardest to reduce its footprint where it can in terms of investing in other forms of power and renewable, sustainable aviation fuel, training on simulators, etc., etc. So it's doing what it possibly can. But I think it also has a calling. Its role is to deliver aid and to support the work of spreading the gospel in very remote and difficult areas. And to do that, planes are an obvious tool to use. It's not inherently bad. It's just acknowledging that flying has a carbon footprint. Therefore, for those of us who have the choice of whether to fly or not, whether it's on holiday or that kind of thing, we might find other ways to do things. But in MAF's case, there are many situations where flying a light aircraft is going to be the best way to get from A to B and to do the work that it's called to do. So I think I don't think MAF is a terrible organisation. I think they're a great organisation, and I think one of the things I like about MAF as I work with them and alongside them is to see that they are serious about their footprint. They are aware of the issues and doing their very best to mitigate them. Flying to Australia from the UK has a footprint of nearly 4 tons. That's my seat, as it were, on the aeroplane. So you're dividing the whole plane by the number of passengers, which is a great deal more than flying that Cessna and delivering the solar panel. So everything has a value.
Yeah, Jacob, what would you add to that? I guess it's essential what you're doing. We're not talking about going on a jolly to Spain, are we? We're talking about saving people's lives.
Yeah, exactly. The example I like to quote a lot is we serve a particular village up near the Venezuela border that is in a valley. You got 4,000 or 5,000 foot mountain peaks on 3 of the 4 sides, and a river that flows out of it. But to the closest, city or town of any real population, it's 200 miles, and the river is just this endless labyrinth of forks and waterfalls, and like a 50-meter waterfall on this river, and in the middle of the jungle. There isn't a road anywhere nearby, and the river is unnavigable for most of its stretch. And so we're talking about a village that's had missionary presence now for over 30 years, has a Bible translation, has a school that is run by the mission organization, taught by the missionaries. That work would not exist without a Cessna 206 to take all the school supplies, all the missionary supplies, all the school food, everything goes in on a light aircraft, and that work would not exist without a small plane.
So, Caroline, some of that damage we've been talking about, can that actually be reversed?
We've cut a lot of trees down, deforestation, particularly in places like the Amazon. But we can also, and we are planting an enormous number of trees. Now, they don't grow overnight, and that's the challenge. It's not going to happen quickly. And also, when you cut down a tree, you destroy a whole ecosystem. So, especially if it's a native, an indigenous rainforest. So it's not quick to replace that, but it is happening. Every increment on the increase in temperature will have an impact on the systems that it's affecting, the global weather systems, etc., sea level rise, etc., etc. So the more we can do to slow it down or to stop it, the better. There's conversations at the moment around whether whether that graph is leveling off, that we're not emitting more and more, but we still have this enormous quantity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and most of them have a very, very long lifetime, so they continue doing their work of warming for many, many, many generations. So we're not going to go back to where we were. What we need to focus on is not going above 1.5 or 1.6, but minimizing the increase.
So, Caroline, what if we don't make the changes? What if it does keep increasing, the temperature, the sea levels? I mean, what is next for the world?
It's more of the same, I suppose, in terms of these extreme weather events, and it's the impact on our poorest global neighbours that we're seeing. So it's more and more people being displaced, more and more people losing their land, their livelihoods, whether that's through fires or droughts or floods. And again, it's the people who will feel that first are not those of us in the rich Western world. They're the people living on the margins. So it's not going to be, there won't be one enormous kind of bang explosion, I don't think. I think it will just be a gradual movement towards an uninhabitable world. And even our non-human neighbours, which of course are facing extinction in huge quantities through a number of things, including climate change. And that has implications for so much, including our food supply. If we don't have pollinators, we won't have food. This is an intricate web of life that we are messing with at our peril.
Guys, this has been really educational, I have to say. Jacob, how can we best be praying for Brazil?
Brazil is so agricultural, and beef production, they're the number 2 beef producer in the world, number 1 exporter in the world. It's like 23% of the world's beef comes from Brazil. And so there is this constant fight between the farmers want to extend where they want to cut the jungle so that they can grow more beef, and the economy benefits from that, obviously, and people have food. But then, I mean, you can fly over swaths of jungle that used to be jungle, and it's just soybean fields, or it's just cow pastures for hours and hours and hours. Brazil's one of the top producers of like 8 agricultural products. So it's not just, make it clear, it's not just beef. It's soy, and it's cotton, and it's citrus, and so there's this constant battle between producing cotton and having jungle remain.
And again, that comes back to a lot of that, as you said, is for the export market, isn't it? So of course,
Right.
It's earning income for Brazil, which is important, but at the
Right.
same time, it's those of us who are probably buying cheap, fast fashion is another whole issue, isn't it?
Right.
Why do we need all that cotton?
Right.
So it comes back again to that human greed element.
There has to be a balance. That's the biggest thing, and I think wisdom for decision makers to come to that balance is a huge thing.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And Caroline, I mean, such a big issue, what we've been talking about, but how can we best be praying into, what we are witnessing around the world?
I think we can be praying that Christians at every level in every country, and particularly those who have sort of leadership positions, just fully take on board our calling, our mandate to be good stewards of creation. But I think as Christians, we also need to think, what are we spending our time and our money and our carbon on, as it were? One of the simplest things we can do in the UK, certainly, is to switch to a renewable electricity tariff. One of the biggest parts of our carbon footprint is heating our home, basically, and running the stuff that happens at home. And if we can't, some people can put solar panels on their roof, but many of us can't do that. But we can just buy renewable electricity. Every provider has that. And that means that somewhere in the world, that electricity has been generated from a renewable source rather than burning fossil fuels. And that's dead easy. So that would be a quick win.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. My big thanks to Jacob Anderson, Pilot and Operations Director from Access de Socorro, and Caroline Pomeroy, CEO of Climate Stewards. MAF International's Carbon Footprint Report, in association with Climate Stewards, will be available later this year. You've been listening to me, Josh Carter, and Flying for Life, MAF UK's podcast. Until next time, bye for now.